Great. So hello everybody, my name is David Lee, and I'm excited to talk to you in this game workshop about how to level up your dialogue in the metaverse through your dialogue writing. Um, just to give a small background on myself, I am a narrative designer at Sandbox and also an editor, and I've been working in games for a couple decades now. So hopefully I've got some stuff to share with you, and I'm excited to get it started. So in this scene, what's going on here? It looks like a fighting game. So if we approach it that way and the dialogue says, "I shall destroy you with fists of fire," it'll totally sync with the player. But however, a picture may be worth 1,000 words, but a few words can make a picture appear very different. So if the dialogue says something like, "Let me show you how tall you'd be if you stood up straight. Your posture is terrible." Obviously, we completely change the context for what this game is about, which leads us to dialogue makes a real difference. And the goal of this presentation is to help you find some tools how you can improve your dialogue in every experience you're working on. So what's the purpose of dialogue in the sandbox? So dialogue fills in the emotional and narrative context of gameplay. And there isn't one style of dialogue that's going to work in any experience. It's highly influenced by the type of game you're making. The dialogue in an action game may be very streamlined, very minimal. In a fantasy RPG, it may be much more expansive and have a lot of lore. So the game's going to really impact your dialogue and also the intended audience. If your audience is, for instance, children, you're going to have one style of a dialogue that might be very simple. And again, if you're creating a game for an adult audience, like particularly an RPG or something, it may be much more expansive, much more highfalutin in its language. So with the caveat that there is no one style of dialogue that's going to work for every game, we've gathered some tips and best practices from the sandbox that we're going to share today. So getting started in the tips, tip number one is be minimalist. So minimalist just means using as few words as possible. But how much is enough? And the answer is exactly how much is needed and not one word more. Another way to think of this is recognize that dialogue interrupts gameplay and we don't want to wear out our welcome as a writer. So we want to be the guest that everyone loves to see and wants to welcome back. We don't want to be the guest that kind of overstays its welcome by, putting too much information on the player's plate. So if you kind of think of what your dialogue should feel like, it should feel like a bonus to the player. And we never want the words we write to stand in the player's way. Our job is to serve the player, not ourselves. So that's the minimalist side, but there are some caveats to go with it. So the first one is, when we want to be short with our dialogue, we also want to make sure we convey the critical information that the player needs. If we fail to do that, it doesn't matter that our dialogue is really short. The player is still not going to appreciate it because we're not helping the player. And also, it's not just about information the player needs. We also want to make it entertaining. We want to have character for our characters. And we'll talk about building character in a moment. And this is something we call foreshadowing. So here's a brief example of how you can be short without doing your job. So Michelle says, "Is short dialogue good?" And the player answers, "Yes, most of the time." Michelle says, "But can it be too short?" "Sure, if you leave out important details, such as, I'm only talking to you so you can tell me how to finish this quest. What should I be doing?" So this is just a case where, again, Michelle is being very minimalist, but she's not doing her job of helping the player know what they need to know. So number one, again, is be minimalist. Number two is reveal character through language. So when we're writing for a character, ask yourself, what's this NPC, what's this person thinking? Put yourself in the voice of that character if you can, and ask yourself, who am I? Why am I talking to you, the player? Why does it matter to me, the NPC? How do I talk? What's my attitude towards the player, towards other characters? What's my vocabulary? What's my tone? For instance, if the NPC is a mechanic, they may have one set of vocabulary that's appropriate to them. Short, simple, simple language, straight to the point. If the character is a scientist, may have much more expansive dialogue with fancier words and such. But the question we should ask ourselves is, as an NPC, how can I make the player engage with me? And so here's a short example of a made-up game. It's just made up an example for this. It's called The Hunted, which is kind of a post-apocalyptic game where there's combat between some scrappy human characters and dangerous aliens. And this is going to be from 5 NPC characters, just speakers, who each have one line of dialogue as the player kind of goes past them. So Roderick, the first character, says, "Galactic war is hell. We haven't had a break in months." So here we're just kind of setting the scene for the player. Okay, galactic war, it's a sci-fi, we're fighting against something, maybe aliens. It's been going on for a while, and it doesn't sound like it's going great for these humans. The second character says, "I love killing. I don't know what your problem is, man." So here we have a completely different attitude, but we don't know if Martinez is affected by the war or it was just crazy when he started, but he is definitely loving this fight. Then Sarah pops up and says, "Does anyone remember Darren? Or was it Daryl? He tried to save Onyx from the creepers." So here we're introducing some elements of the world. We don't define what the creepers are. We'll let the player fill in the blanks later. But we introduce a character that no one can remember their name of, and that he heroically tried to save some character named Onyx that we also don't know anything about. And Ricardo says, "Daniel was his name. In the end, there wasn't much of him left. Just one hand." So Ricardo, as well as having a better memory than Sarah, is sharing more details about what the creepers are. It shows that they're dangerous, they're deadly, they're super violent, and we're just kind of doing a little world building as we pass by. And then the final character, Jane, says, "Onyx gave me a grenade pull tab as a ring. I think he was kidding, but I remember it how I like." So here we're just introducing a character who is, we don't know if Onyx, had a serious romantic relationship with her, or it was just soldiers, it was just a soldier's prank with her. But she is obviously, putting herself in kind of a happy place by thinking about it. So we've really quickly, with these 5 characters, just painted a kind of a short picture of the world and a little bit of the inner life of the characters, just to give you a flavor of what the experience is like as you go by. So tip number 3 is be clear. Because remember, we don't want to confuse the player unless, maybe if it's a puzzle game and we're playing, mental games with the player, it might make sense to try to confuse the player. But in most cases, you don't want to confuse the player. You don't want to make the game harder for them, by not writing good dialogue. So if we think what our narrative should do, our job is to help the player, not to confuse them, again, unless we really want to do that for some reason of our own. As we talk to the player, we can add little signposts in our dialogue. So here's an example that Brendan, one of the writers, and I were talking about. I was like, well, if the quest goal is going to be in a windmill, we could have the NPC, the quest giver, mention the windmill just to kind of signpost to the player that might be a place they want to go. And Brendan pointed out that a clever way to do this might be not to do it so overtly, to say, you might want to check out the windmill, but say like, "I hate windmills." Not just to plant the seed in the player's mind that the windmill is there, and when they see the windmill, that language will trigger them that, hey, this might be involved with something this might be something I should check out. So while we're being clear, the trick is to do it without doing the dreaded info dump or exposition. And I think we all know what an info dump is, but I'll say it. I'll do my own info dump on an info dump, which is when your NPC goes blah 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 blah, not interacting with the player, just sharing a bunch of information in big blocks of text that are kind of daunting to players. And I'm a writer, and I don't like to see big blocks of text in front of me because I'm playing to enjoy myself, and reading a bunch of text isn't always what I want to do when I'm playing. So I like to try to think of what the player needs to know first, and then find a way to share it in character through the NPCs. Because we never want to forget, it's the player that's the hero. To me, I want the player to feel like they are driving the action, they are the hero, everything revolves around them, and they have a really active voice in their interactions with the NPCs. It shouldn't just feel like the NPCs are just talking to them as if the player doesn't exist. So here's an example of making dialogue more clear. And it came from an actual, so I just grabbed some actual partner text. I made it anonymous so you couldn't tell, I removed the IP information from it. But in this case, Sergeant Rogers is talking to the player near the beginning of experience and sort of training them to fight in the experience. So here's the before text, again, made more anonymous from the original text, but the same substance. And again, this is not bad text at all. I don't mean to single it out. It's just when I edit, I try to look for ways, how can I improve it? That's my job as an editor. How can I make this better? So even if it's good, I want to make it even better. So Roger says, "Hello, I'm Sergeant Rogers, and I'll be your guide through this experience." And anything that kind of popped out to me as something I might want to edit, I've just put in red for this example. So to me, through this experience, it takes me outside of the play space inside the sandbox, and I want to keep the player inside that play space as much as possible. So that was something I noted that I might want to change. And then the player didn't react to this statement. It was just going on to the next statement. Rogers continues, "You know me from the tryout session I held a few days ago. I'll need to further assess your strength before asking you to help me on assignments." So the two bits here that popped out to me here that maybe weren't as clear as they could be is Roger says, "You know me from the tryout session." So he is doing a bit of an info dump, and the player has no agency within this conversation. Roger is just telling them and driving the conversation. The player doesn't have a chance to interject. And when he said, "before asking you to help me on assignments," to me, when someone says, "asking you to help me," to me, it triggers this feeling that someone is asking me to help them move. And I immediately, as a player, want to start thinking of excuses, why I shouldn't help. Hey, I've got to help my grandma do something else. Sorry, I can't help you move your couch today, bro. So that stood out to me. So the edits, where the changes I'll show in green here are my suggestions on how to make this a little clearer and stronger. So in the first block, Roger says, "Hi, I'm Sergeant Rogers, and I'll be your guide today." So the difference between today and through this experience is today keeps you in the here and now, in the experience. And this change, substituting one word for three, is not a big one. But if you do a bunch of substituting one slightly better word for three words that are not quite as good throughout your dialogue, you really, really punch it up, and it will have an impact on the player that they will appreciate. So don't undercount the one word edit you made. Doing that cumulatively can be great for your dialogue. So the second thing I changed or suggested changing in this first dialogue is for the player to go, "I know you." So it's basically the same thing that happened in the original dialogue, except in this case, it's the player that's recognizing Rogers rather than vice versa. So the player feels more emotionally engaged with Rogers. And then Rogers responds to the player saying, "I thought you looked familiar. We met at the tryouts a few days ago, but I need to assess your strength before letting you take on assignments." So the difference here is a small one. Again, it's just a psychological game to make it like something we could withhold from the player to make the player want to do this assignment more. So now switching back to the original dialogue. So the player then fights some basic enemies, and then Rogers kind of debriefs them again. And he says, "They're not going to let you off that easy. Be prepared. You're going to need to fight the rest of them at the same time." So I highlighted, "they're not going to let you off that easy," because it's kind of a lot of words that doesn't convey that much. And then similarly, the second half, you're going to need to fight the rest of them at the same time. I think we could say that a little more succinctly and a little more in character for Rogers. That's going to help the player feel good. Then Rogers continues, you could take them out easier by using your special ability, hold mouse 1 to charge it. You could take them out easier. Again, it's 6 words where we could probably do it in fewer words, which in my edits, I suggested saying that first fight was easy. So we're deprecating the player a little bit, but it's in the tone of a drill sergeant, right? Be prepared to fight them in greater numbers. Basically says the same thing as the original dialogue, just shorter, and again, it feels like it's more grounded in the experience and a little less generic. And then on the closing bit, balance the odds by using your special ability. Again, just feels more tactical, more something like a sergeant would say. And so if you compare A to B, I think you'll see that B feels better as a player. You can read it faster, and it also feels a little more in character, which is part of being clear. So the fourth tip is to be engaging, which is super easy for me to say, and it's harder for all of us, including myself, to actually do in our dialogue writing. But here are some ways you can be more engaging. So one is vary your rhythm and structure. Make it fun to read. Don't just have the same rhythm in every statement, particularly if you're sharing similar information. And be consistent. Make it feel like you're living in the same world from character to character, but don't repeat yourself. Find new ways to share similar thoughts, even if you do have similar things to say. Still make it everyone interesting, have a point of view that engages with the player. And if you think of your NPC dialogue, particularly the one-liners, the speakers, think of them as snapshots that the player can assemble in their great big, this wonderful thing we call the human brain is really good at taking bits of information and putting them together into a story. Think of them as you're putting together these little snapshots that the player will assemble and create their own version of the story you originally created. To me, that's just a fun way to think of it, and it helps me plan better. And when you're creating characters, or when you're creating dialogue for characters that originally didn't have any traits assigned to them, I find it really handy to give them at least one identifiable trait. Are they proud? Are they a broken person? Just give them something and then imbue that into their dialogue. It's going to make them feel more like a real person. And if you talk to a bunch of people who all feel this way, that are all variated and feel unique, it's going to feel much more interesting to the player. And just a super side note, in most experiences, particularly with minor characters, one trait is probably all you need. Like, you don't need to create 5 things about this character that has one line. Just one is good. Just make them unique, make them cool, and make your dialogue rock. And then when you're writing your dialogue, just ask yourself, does your dialogue add something, or is it unnecessary? And if it feels unnecessary, then you need to go back and work on it or remove it. So here's an example of this in action. So I decided we're going to write a character of a cat called Fluffy, and we're going to try to make this character interesting. So pass 1, Fluffy says, "Hi, I'm a cat." Okay, so the player can probably see that this voxel character is a cat. So we didn't really accomplish anything with this dialogue, but we did do one important thing, which is to get something on the page to work from. Sometimes that's the hardest part, just staring at the blank cell or page in your word processor. So pass 2, okay, let's add a trait. Let's make Fluffy a sassy kitty. So, meow, I'm a sassy cat. Okay, we've made a slight bit of progress, but not much. We've given him a character, and we've given him a little, it says meow now, so he's being a little more cat-like. But let's try to go a little deeper with this in pass 3. Meow, I hate people, especially you. But you can do something to make me hate you less. So now Fluffy is starting to develop a voice as a character that, Fluffy's definitely sassy. But let's see if we can take this a little further and actually engage the player in the conversation. So pass 4 is, meow, hate meow. Meow hate you less if meow something for meow. And then the player says, oh, who's a judgy kitty witty? So the cat is being very cat-like, and then the player is doing what I unfortunately will do if I see a cat that doesn't want to engage with me, which is I'm gonna fight to engage with that cat just because they put me down. That's just how I react to cats. So let's continue now. The Fluffy doesn't appreciate the player's response to him. It says, meow, fine meow collar. Meow, misses it, meow. And the player says, kitty need its collar, how adorbs. So here we've engaged the player. We've given Fluffy some identifiable characteristics. And I think we've made, just with 2 lines each, two for the player and two for Fluffy, we've given a good little kickoff to this quest that's going to make it more memorable, definitely, than when we started, when he said, hi, I'm a cat, can you find my collar? This is just an example of how you can work through iterating to make your dialogue more engaging. So moving on to the next tip is, this is an old writer's phrase, which is kill your darlings, which means get rid of the things that you as the writer really love that probably no one else does. So always remember that other people don't love your writing like you do, or since I wrote this, I guess I should say, other people don't love my writing like I do, because I also have to kill my darlings all the frickin' time. It's just something we do. They pop out of us, and we just have to be vigilant. It doesn't matter if they're there in our first pass. As long as they're not there in our last pass, we're all good. So again, just remember, most players don't like to read dialogue. So when they do, let's make it worth their while. And let's look at some of the things that might be our darlings that deserve a mercy killing. So number 1 is details that only matter to you. Say, for instance, you've done a whole lot of world building for your experience, and you want to share it all, and you've got a character, and they're just sharing those blocks of text we talked about earlier. That might be something you can either trim down, you can get rid of it, you can break it up and have other characters give little bits of it, but just don't give those big blocks of stuff that only matters to you, which means get rid of that exposition. We don't want to have those exposition info dumps anywhere in our dialogue. Another one, and this is a really tricky one, because I love writing jokes. Jokes that don't fit the narrative, it can be a real stumbling block and just throw the player right out of your experience. And, when we consider that our experience might be played by characters from different cultures, they speak a different native language, having jokes that are universal is really hard. So if you're writing a comedic experience, by all means, work hard in your jokes, invest in them. But if you're just tossing in throwaway jokes in an experience that is more serious in nature, just do that sparingly. And lastly, just as an umbrella, any dialogue that doesn't advance the story or action is something we might want to give a mercy killing to. So next is tip 6 is keep calm and follow the process. And this is a 4-step process I like to follow when I'm writing, because following this process, it gives me confidence and also makes sure I'm going to take some steps so I just don't dash something off and think it's great without having it verified. So step 1 is to plan and write your first draft. Step 2 is to read it aloud and see what changes you immediately want to make. This one is a lifesaver for me, because sometimes I'll write something and it feels fine to me on the page until I read it aloud, and then I go, no one would ever say that, David. Don't do that. Fix it. Make it feel more natural. And not only you read it aloud, share your dialogue with other people to hear their reaction. If you're really ambitious, you could put it in the game maker and play it yourself, or have someone else play it also. I usually recommend do a couple rounds on the page before you put it in Game Maker, because you'll save yourself a lot of cut and paste. The next step is to get feedback from those other people, or if you're the only person in the room, from yourself. And this step can be a little painful, but just remember that you don't want to have things that are going to annoy the player end up in your final dialogue. It's much better to hear about it, fix it, and then when the player reads it, they'll have thought you did it great job right from the start. They won't know that other people helped you and gave you feedback and said that it sucked before you made it better. So the feedback step is super important. And then the fourth step is to revise and try to fix the problem. Fix the things that are weak. And then when you've got something that is really resonating, see if you can double down and just really polish it and make it even better. And the last tip is don't bore us, get to the chorus, which is, it's a songwriter's phrase, which means, don't dawdle around on your chorus on your song. On your intro verse, your introduction. Get to the hook of the song, the chorus, quickly before the listener loses interest. And why is this important? Because in the Sandbox, your experience is one of hundreds of thousands. So if you look at that Sandbox map, just always remember that you are here. You're just one little experience among a whole bunch of other experiences. With season 3, I think we have 98 experiences, and subsequent seasons will have even more experiences. So it's going to get even harder to interest people in your experience. So what do we want to do? We want to make our dialogue distinctive. We want to grab the player's attention fast and make the player care before they can move on to the next experience. And this is not just a dialogue issue. This is a level design. This is an art issue. But what we can control as a dialogue writer is our dialogue. So let's make sure our dialogue works hard and tries to really grab the player quickly. So one way to test this is to pretend you know nothing about your experience before you jump into it. And then ask yourself, coming in knowing nothing, is your dialogue still interesting? Is it still understandable? Again, remember, you're coming in knowing nothing. You don't know the world building you did before. You don't know the characters. Is it understandable on first read? And third, and most importantly probably, is it entertaining? That's what we're here for. We want to entertain people with our experiences. So interesting, understandable, entertaining. Those are 3 great benchmarks to ask yourselves. And it's not always easy to give an honest answer to that question, but doing so will help you write better dialogue. And that is all of the 7 tips I have to share today. So we're just going to quickly shift gears really quickly just to talk about some of the basics of how dialogue writing works in the Sandbox. So just on the technical side, I think you probably all know this, but we can only use plain text. We can't use special characters. We just use the English alphabet, no accent characters, no emojis, no backslashes, just plain English language. And then we've got 2 classes of NPCs in the Sandbox. We have speakers, which are NPCs that make statements only and don't interact with the player. And then we have askers, who are NPCs who do engage with dialogue with the player. So for speakers, we have a 300 character limit. And for askers, they have a little less, 260 characters. Now, when you're writing in Google Sheets, you can use the length function, len, parentheses, to count characters. And after you start doing that, you'll quickly get a sense for how many characters 260 characters is. And I think those limitations are helpful for all of us as writers because they get us to focus and make it shorter like the player wants to hear from us. And while we're using plain text, we can use some basic HTML. We can use color, for yellow to call out quest goals or things like mouse 1 that are important. And we can use bold or italic text. Personally, and this is just me personally, I don't like to use bold and italic text. I think if I want to emphasize something, I will very occasionally use all caps for a word or two. You don't want to overuse it, but I think just using all caps ends up looking better on the page than using bold and italic, which don't always read great for me. And there's some text on the right. That's just for people who are fast readers and wanted something to read while I was talking. So moving on to some nuts and bolts. Again, as I mentioned, we prefer writing in a spreadsheet. We use Google Docs, the Sandbox, and we have a template, which I've linked here in my presentation. And if you don't have a copy of this presentation, Becky can give you the link. The great thing about this sheet is that it reshares all our formatting and text guidelines, and it also gives you a basic structure to start from, which includes at the top the barks, which are the initial dialogue from a quest giver before the quest is initiated, what they say before you've initiated the quest. And then the static NPCs are those NPCs who just deliver that one line. That's all they have to live for. So make their one line great. And then there are the askers, which are the two-way conversations, which is quest dialogue with player responses. And one thing I haven't mentioned in my talk is that the player responses are essentially another NPC you get to write for. So I just try to put myself, what kind of attitude do I want the player to have in this experience? And how can I, make that come through really strongly in their dialogue while keeping their responses very, very short. That's one thing level designers always tell us is don't make your answers too long, man. Keep them nice and short. Players don't want to read long player responses. And with that, I've wrapped up everything I want to share, but I'm just going to put up a screen which recaps those 7 rules. So just to quickly recap. Number 1, be minimalist. Remember that less is more. Number 2, reveal character through language. Let the NPC's words define them. Number 3, be clear. Don't confuse the player. Number 4, always be engaging and always try to have each dialogue add something to the experience. Number 5, kill the darlings. Take out the stuff that only matters to you and doesn't matter to anyone else. Number 6, keep calm and follow the process, which is write, read, get feedback, and revise. And the last one is don't bore us, get to the chorus. Keep everything interesting, understandable, and entertaining. So that's all I've prepared in my deck. So I just want to thank everyone for your time. I really appreciate it. It's exciting for us to talk to you. The better your dialogue is, the better it is for everyone in the Sandbox experience. And at this point, I will take down my little, stop sharing my screen. And if anyone has any questions, I would love to answer them. Put me on the hot seat, challenge me, question me. It's all good. I love to hear it.
Well, thank you so much, David. The question that I have for game-based learning experiences, you may want to include, you have to explain things a lot more unless it's very, very much interactive learning where you're doing something and it sort of symbolizes something where you have more visuals. And sometimes you just have to use a lot more text and it's really challenging to cut that down. And that's something that I'm sort of running into myself. So I wonder if you have any advice about how to keep that as simple and minimal as possible when you need to share certain information.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the 7 steps will be helpful towards that. And what I do is, yeah, I mean, we all start off with a whole bunch of information we want to share. The trick is really just what are the most important building blocks? And remember that, the more text we put out there, the less the player will take away, right? If you overload them with information, as I may have done in my talk, because I
It's a
tend to talk
difficult
fast.
balance.
It's a difficult balance. And I think that the step that can really help there is just to read it aloud and share it with other people and get their reaction. Because sometimes we think we need to share more than we do. Like we need to give the player, no matter what their age is, credit for being able to figure out more than we tell them. So if you can kind of signpost them through it, I think, and let them fill in the gaps. It also, to me, it engages the learning part of the mind more strongly than if just everything is spelled out exactly for me.
That's great. I was thinking, sometimes it could also be helpful to try and spread out information in different areas and make things optional or something to explore and discover to make it a little bit more fun to find those little things instead of just info dump all at once.
Yeah, and I think I think that's a fantastic point you're making, Becky. That was something I sort of mentioned, but I probably could have made stronger in my presentation, which was rather than the info dump, yeah, spread it out among several characters. And for optional information, you're absolutely right. You can put a speaker with additional information that's optional. It's just whatever your main quest line is, that's where you want to have the important critical stuff and give the player the choice to go off and find more. Because as a player, I never like it when I'm forced to read a bunch of stuff that I don't want to read. It's true in every game. I don't even like watching long, super cool cinematic videos. I'm like, I want to get to the gameplay, man.
Yeah, I get that. That's really helpful for me. Thank you. Um,
Thank you for the question.
we have a question from Brendan. What's a good way to capture different types of voices for authentic dialogue, like a caring grandma, a military man on his day off, a nervous waiter, etc.? What steps do you use?
Well, the first one I like to use is remembering people I've spoken to. And these can be people I've actually encountered in my life, or they could be people I've, quote unquote, encountered in fiction or in movies or in comics. And, you know, maybe there's a memorable character. Did they have certain phrases they use? I might rework those phrases, reuse them. It's not plagiarism if you're inspired by something and you rework it for your own purposes. That is like 95% of all writing. You should never feel bad about that. If you're inspired by something and it helps you shortcut your way to creating a memorable character of your own, I think it's totally fine to lean on that. One thing that is difficult for all of us is writing characters who are not, the people we interact with on a daily basis. So, I'm a native English speaker, so writing American characters comes very easily to me, but writing characters from other cultures would come more difficult to me. And I think it's the opposite for people who from French or Spanish or another language, it's their first language when they're writing English. And, I'd like to say there's a great shortcut for that. There really isn't, other than, listening to a lot of English dialect being spoken and picking up the rhythms, because the rhythms are different from language to language. And I think that's one of the hardest things to capture
I would imagine
in
also if you're
English.
talking about if you're creating a game that's historical, that would also be a big challenge.
Yeah, I mean, there's a saying, you know what you write. And so if you weren't familiar with that historical period, I would get really familiar with that historical period before I started to make an experience about it. And I might choose something that I already knew, because that's going to be a lot easier for me. And I'm a little lazy like that.
I'm sitting here on mute giggling. So we have another question. How could you balance the dialogue, or which characters should talk more than others? Since inside the experience, you need to create an environment for the game, but it would spam the player with a bunch of dialogue bubbles. So how do you balance which characters talk more?
I don't know that I have a great answer to that, other than say, it's harder than it sounds when you're putting it in a presentation. In a presentation, it's easy. You control the variables and you're not actually in a game experience. So yeah, one's question is a good one. I mean, I just prioritize the information the player needs to know first, put that into the main quest characters, and then I try to put flavor around it. And yeah, it could be that this could become a kill your darlings moment where
Mm.
you're putting all this flavor and it's optional, but to your point, there's all these dialogue bubbles around it. It's just too much. So you might just have to cut some back. I mean, I'm sorry, I don't have a better answer, but I think you're asking the right questions, and sometimes you just have to kill your darlings.
I wonder if maybe choosing which character just seems the most interesting and giving them a little bit more airtime, so to speak. Like, or maybe even having two NPCs in the space that are next to each other that have an interesting sort of chemistry, where you could
Mhm.
have a little bit of back and forth where they're giving you information in an entertaining way, so it doesn't, and they're right in front of you, so that, if they're using, maybe if they're talking to each other with a speaker, then you can see it and it's fun and short and just, a little bit different.
Yeah, for instance, you could, if in your situation, there are two characters, they're next to each other, they could each have an initial bark that starts kicking off their relationship dynamic. And then yeah, you could start with one, and he says, then you go talk to the other one to actually get your quest. And so you could have that little one from each character, then you talk to one character, then you talk to the other character. And then the other element, which I always try to bring to bear, is the player's voice can also have an interaction with those characters. You can kind of create a persona for how you want the player to be within this experience, and have them engage with those two different people. And that gives you three variables, which can make it even more interesting.
I think I saw an example of exactly what you're talking about in the alpha lobby.
Like, for instance, when Snoop Dogg and Steve Aoki are going back and forth.
Mm-hmm. Yep. kind of exemplifying what you're talking about there.
Cool. Yeah.
When you have a big message to deliver, what's usually best for the player's experience? One, to break it in pieces, two, say it all in one phrase.
I think ideally, if you can fit what you need to say in one statement, then that's awesome because you have interrupted the flow of gameplay to the minimum amount possible while accomplishing the maximum amount. So I think that's great, but that may not always be possible. So I would, yes, rather than having, like all 260 characters just totally filled up, I might stop at like 180 and breaking into two phrases. And again, just being judicious in how much you say. And oftentimes, again, what we think we need to say, we don't always need to say. And that's just a good question to ask ourselves, just to make sure. It's just like just be sure that you need to say what you're saying.
You were talking earlier about killing your darlings. If there's something that you really like and you would like to keep in the game, maybe you feel like it adds a lot more flavor to the story. I was thinking about how, you go into Skyrim and you play, and there's books everywhere. And one of my favorite things was just to go wander around and steal people's books, and just read
Hmm.
them. It kind of gives you a bit of a heads up about some things you may encounter later on, but it's not critical information. And so it's sort of like one of those little things we were talking about where you can go and discover some things. So if you're really, really excited about something, you can kind of hide it in there. But um, I guess sometimes if your text can be broken down really, really small, but there's something that you just feel like would be really fun to include, then maybe you can do something like that.
Yeah, and if you think of what kind of game Skyrim is as an RPG, that's totally appropriate. That audience, they love to dig into the lore. So if Skyrim was a real action-oriented game, then those books wouldn't be, I think, of so much interest to the players. But that's a very audience appropriate, so that's cool.
I see a question. Do you think that adding text tutorials about how a mechanic works, i.e., the live system in a game, is a good idea, or should it be better to simply allow the player to discover it for themselves as they play along in an experience?
I don't know that there's one all-purpose answer for that, and I would say, again, who is your intended audience for the experience? Is it an experience that's intended for a more experienced player?
Mhm.
Then I think in that case, yeah, let them figure it out. They're going to feel more satisfaction. But if it's an experience that is, for instance, it's a simple, very mainstream game. It's a multiplayer experience that's more of a social hub. In that case, I think it's better to explain it rather than having the risk of them being confused and not knowing what to do in your experience. But again, just think of what that player needs and then try to address it as best you can. You can't know everything they want, but you can take a pretty good guess. And that's really all we can do until we actually see players playing and get their feedback.
Like, for example, and this is sort of along the lines of what I'm doing with games that help people learn. I'm building a controls tutorial that's hands-on for an absolute beginner, but I've also seen and used just rich text formatting to highlight specific words that are important as I'm explaining. Here's the button that you need to press to do this. And it's just very straightforward. There's no interactive hands-on. It's just very quick list. Here's what you do. But
Mhm.
there's a difference between if maybe you made a level that is for speedrunners who are really good already. They don't need that information at all. These sorts of things to keep in mind, like know your audience exactly. Just want
Yeah,
to point an
and
example out.
another thing you can do is just ask, "Hey, do you need the controls?" And if they say no, then dialogue closes, they're off on their way. If they say yes, then they can actually go through the steps. That's
Yeah.
another way to handle it for
That's exactly what I
very
did in
broad
this
audience. Yeah.
control tutorial I'm doing. It's like it's part of a game, but it says, I need help with controls first is one of the answer options. And it teleports you. And then that's just a secret area in the game. And then you can just go back to normal and get back into the action if you need it. But if you don't, you're not bothered by it. It's just an answer option for the first thing. And then you can move on with your life if you don't want to.
Yeah. I try to address as broad of an audience as I can, even,
Mhm.
if we're the experience is maybe more targeted. I prefer just to like welcome in as many people as we can.
So we have a question. Knowing that it's the best to keep small dialogues seems to be a challenge to use few texts and still give your character a remarkable personality. In cases like that, What's the best to do? Forget about small dialogues or try to develop this personality in different moments of a quest line?
That's a good question from Chaco,
Hmm.
and thank you for that. So when I said pick one trait for a character, one reason for that is one trait is very easy to convey in a dialogue. At the very basic level, when Fluffy the cat was saying, "I'm a sassy cat," that's starting to do it. So if you just work in a little bit of that one trait, you're still making that character identifiable. And you may be able to do it in just 2 or 3 words that are different from your starting dialogue, just to give them a little bit of flavor, a little bit of spice, a little bit of things to make them more interesting and memorable. So the challenge, and it's not easy, is how to do it in short dialogues, which it takes practice. But if you go in with the mindset, I think you can save a lot of time by, instead of letting people tell you that the dialogue reads as flat and the characters aren't very differentiated, start from the beginning to try to give them those little bits with very few words.
I think that's great. I was just thinking, also, I want to tap into Brendan's expertise.
Actually, I need to call out Brendan helped me a lot with this deck. He listened to my first read through and gave me a ton of cool tips that helped me, which was part of that read it out loud and
Mhm.
revise phase. So thank you, Brendan, for helping me make this presentation better for everyone.
Okay, Brendan says, my tip is this: best way to make dialogue pop is have both characters waiting for each other to shut up.
And he says, give them motivation to want to talk.
Hmm.
Cool. Good tip, Brendan. Thank you.
That's my tip. Ha 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 ha. All right,
Brendan is
we've got
dominating chat right now.
yeah. Oh, here's one. David, your favorite works of media for their great dialogue.
I think comic books are a good medium because they're, visual and text working together, kind of similar to how it does in the Sandbox. I also love to listen to great dialogue by great writers and read great writers. Like, for instance, George R. R. Martin's books have awesome dialogue. It's kind of long, sumptuous dialogue that's probably not appropriate for the Sandbox, but the way he voices so many different characters side by side and just kind of does it naturally is something that's really just awesome to read. But I think you can take inspiration from anywhere. And when you hear something someone say interesting, just let the little writer part of your mind just go lock it away. You know, like Oscar, there's this apocryphal or not Oscar Wilde saying where someone says something clever and Oscar says, "I wish I'd said that," and his friend says, "Don't worry, Oscar, you will soon." And that's true for all of us as writers. We can, we're just, if you keep your ear open, you can listen and see so much that you can filter into your own work in your own voice later.
Hmm. And I think that's a really great way to think about maybe how you would write your game dialogue, to think about keeping it in those short little bits and thinking more about those visuals to tell the story as much as you can.
Yeah, I mean, comic book writers have their own space limits,
Hmm.
that's one reason I like them as an inspiration. They're working with the same restrictions we have,
Hmm.
which again is
Exactly.
not
It's
really a
very
restriction.
close.
It's just a focus. It's not a restriction.
It's just a format, really.
Yeah, it's been my pleasure to talk to y'all.
It was awesome. We love getting more content from this department, from this team. Narrative design is so important because, like you said, it could be completely flat. It could be completely disengaging so easily if you don't take the time to get feedback from others. And, if you don't take that time to cut out as many words as possible, because it is cumulatively, it makes a huge difference.
And never get discouraged if your first draft sucks. It just means you have more work to do, and it makes it easier to see what you need to fix.
Mhm. All right. Well, thanks so much for
All right.
for your effort getting this all put together. Fernando says, and please remember, everything is stories. Yes.
Thank you, Fernando. That's very true. Good point.
All right. Thanks so
All
much,
right.
Fernando.
Cheers, everybody.